Jenna, shall you start?
Yes.
Jenna? Okay. Good evening to all. On behalf of the Center for ADIVASI Research and Development, Bhubaneswar, Odisha, India, in association with Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, and Central University of Odisha, Koraput, India, it's a great pleasure to welcome all the participants in the global digital platform, those who have joined in this Zoom meeting, YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, to the World Human Sciences and Management Conference. On behalf of the Indian people, it is my great honor to introduce Professor Alex to the World Human Sciences and Management Conference. The broad theme of this conference, the World Human Sciences and Management Conference, AGNOTOLOGICAL context, disciplinary practices of social science and policy frame. I'd like to thank the patrons of this conference, the director of the IIM Sambalpur, Vice Chancellor of the Central University of Odisha, Koraput, and conveners of this meeting, Professor Chandri Prasad Nanda, and the futurist, Mr. Charudata Panigrahi. In terms of the background of the Professor, he is the author and professor at the Sociology at the Brooklyn College in New York, United States. He is the coordinator of the Policing and Social Justice Project at Brooklyn College. Some of his, particularly, he was originally from Houston, Texas. And just I can say that some of his important work, which was published in 2009, The City of Disorder, How the Quality of Life Came and Transformed in New York Politics, which was published in 2009 by New York University Press. And another is The End of Policing, which was published in 2017. So in this book, he, rather simply reforming it, he argues that the rise of policing in the world was rooted in three primary forms of economic exploitation: colonialism, slavery, and the rise of industrialization in the 19th century. Following the George Floyd protest, Professor Alex work received wide public interest in alternatives to policing, as well as the movement to defund bully. Okay, this is very briefly about the Professor Alex. The title of this presentation would be presented by Professor Alexis: The End of Policing, Producing Public Safety Without Police. So before going to Professor Alex will present nearly 30 to 40 minutes. Before going to listen from Professor Alex, I would like to invite the futurist, Mr. Charudata Panigrahi, to introductory remarks on this particular theme. Mr. Charudata Panigrahi.
Thank you, Professor Lima. Hello, Professor Alex. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you so much.
Last time you had a cyclone.
Yes.
We had to push this, yes. So in Odisha, I mean, most of our participants today are in Odisha, then other parts of India and other parts of the world also. But in Odisha, we are known to we are used to have natural disasters quite often, and that's because the east side of India, gets hotter, and the sea waves get higher, wilder and higher. So that inundates, and a lot of cyclones and a lot of problems. We face a lot of problems. Very interesting topic and very relevant topic, because discussing about policing, and this is very important for our economy, for our social life, for our day-to-day life, for our family life, for everything, even for wearing masks or sanitizing. We need policing now, and things have come to such a pass that for every little thing we need policing. So Professor Alex, we often wonder whether policing is something that has got into our habit. Did the slave patrol, which started in 18th century, has it actually gone into our system that without policing we can't imagine our lives, or has it become imperative that our moral integrity has gone so awry, has gone so out of sync, that all this immorality, all these unethical work, and all these derelictions from man-made or human-made rules and regulations are actually necessitating policing. Where are we? I mean, we often think about this. Why this policing? We think about citizen policing. We think about, okay, fine, it's good. We should abolish policing, but can we do without that? I mean, can we do with abolition of policing? That's a question which has been paramount, which has been quite bothering all of us, because it's not new in India also. Professor Alex, you'd be happy to know that we have been thinking, many of the civil society organizations, small groups, people have been thinking about making policing more human. So there comes the other aspect of policing. So are we talking about policing or abolition of policing because there are no reforms possible? It's not possible to reform the police force? Or do we see police force as a tyrannical force rather than a helping force, a force which can handhold, which can help, which can support, and not always beat people or kill people, like what has happened now in the US, a fresh wave? So whether our lives matter, their lives matter, what does it show? Because no corner of this world today is free from strikes, free from uh, problems, free from street wars, street battles. Let's face it. I mean, we can couch all this by saying that, look, we have made such progress, and today, as we are speaking, people have gone to space, opening tourism. Yeah, but even to enter that area where this rocket was launched, you need police. You need police to protect that area, lest somebody gets into that place and trespass that area and do something to the rocket. So you see what's happening in Afghanistan. You see, it's not only about army or fighting forces, it's also about policing. So where do you draw the line? Do you say policing only means no arms, no cruelty, no third degree, and only talking sense? And for every third degree or for every excess, we go back to human rights? We have human rights commissions everywhere in all the countries, barring a few African countries. So what do we do? Where do we stand in terms of policing? We are also excited to hear from you. And this is probably one of the biggest platforms and consistent, regular platforms. We have webinars, we have discussions on various topics of relevance, and various topics of total relevance. So welcome, Professor Alex. We'll be happy to hear from you, get your thoughts, and that in turn will shape our thoughts, because many youngsters are this platform. So we have students, we have practitioners, we have faculty members, we have teachers, we have senior people, we have everyone in this platform, a cross section of the society, and everyone who's every day at every moment affected, influenced by policing. So whether we wear a mask when we go out of the house, we don't wear a mask, we pay fines for driving fast, or we don't pay fines for driving fast. So how do we work around this? What are our thoughts? Because policing is probably the biggest issue today that we face, whether it's a disease or it's a crime. So over to you, Professor Alex. Happy to hear from you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Panagrahi, for those challenging opening thoughts, and I hope to try to address those as directly as I can over the course of my talk. Thank you, Professor Lima, for the introduction, and Professor Mohapatra for the invitation to join this very serious group of people trying to think through these very difficult questions. So it's a great honor to be invited to be part of this conversation. I have been to India, and I have read some scholarship on policing in India and have met some Indian police officials over the years, but I am no expert on Indian policing. And I'm certainly not here today to give you a lecture about the particulars of, how policing and public security should be organized at this particular moment in India. I will use this opportunity, though, in the chat to just alert people to a forthcoming book that I've had a chance to read in advance of publication from Radha Kumar at Syracuse University here in the United States, called Police Matters: The Everyday State and Caste Politics in South India from 1900 to 1975. And I think this is a book that's very consistent in some ways in my own understanding about the nature of policing, not just in the United States, but internationally, and understanding its kind of deep functional roots. So my talk will be primarily about the United States and the development of these ideas there, but then I will try to talk more generally and sort of theoretically about the nature of abolitionist thinking and concretely what that might look like. And then perhaps in the Q&A, we can talk more about the relevance and applicability of this to the specific context that you all are operating in. So as you may be aware, police in the United States kill over 1,000 people every year. And these deaths are disproportionately concentrated among our most vulnerable populations, including racial minorities, indigenous populations, but also people who are experiencing mental health crises, people who are homeless, are much, much more likely to be subjected to police arrest, police use of force, and police killing. And it is in that context that we have been experiencing now several years of sustained protest activity and political mobilization, and a wide-ranging conversation about the future direction of public safety, security, and policing in the United States. Now, this conversation becomes most powerful initially after the police killing of Mike Brown in St. Louis, Eric Garner in New York City, Tamir Rice in Ohio, in this period about 6-7 years ago. And out of that conversation, our political leadership at both the local and federal level said, we see there's a problem, but the solution is a series of police reforms. President Obama at that time created a commission, a task force on 21st century policing, staffed with academic experts, practitioners, and a few advocates to develop a broad range of reforms that could help address these problems of excess police violence, racially targeted policing, and a broader kind of culture of impunity within American policing. Now, many of these reforms revolve around the concept of procedural justice. And this is the idea that when legal actors in a courtroom, on the street, take the time to explain what they're doing, give people a chance to tell their side of the story, and then follow proper legal procedures, that people feel better about the outcome of that interaction, even if they end up getting a ticket or getting arrested or getting a judgment against them in court. they feel better about it because they feel the proper procedure has been followed. And so this has led to a whole set of procedural reforms to policing, enhancements to training, body cameras, changes to rules about the use of force and racial profiling, increases in oversight bodies, more civilian review boards, these kinds of things. And all of this is designed to restore public confidence in the police so that police can continue their mission of enforcing the law, which is assumed to be sort of automatically beneficial to everyone in society. So all of this is deeply rooted in a very traditional liberal legal formalism. This idea that the law reflects the interests of society and that police and courts are needed to enforce that legal order in order to create a kind of level playing field so that social, economic, and political activity can flourish. Now, there are some problems, though, with this framework. Some of this is a bit of a fantasy that too often we have convinced ourselves of because we don't want to look more deeply at the ways in which both these legal frameworks and the police who enforce them are not, in fact, committed to creating broad prosperity, are not, in fact, primarily concerned with creating legal equality, economic equality, or political equality. And this is where Professor Kumar's book that I mentioned comes in. She makes the claim that policing through much of the 20th century was in part a project to reproduce the caste system, which is not a system for producing equality or broad prosperity. It's a system that produces profound inequalities within Indian society. And in the American context, we see this in relationship to the problems of first slavery, and then Jim Crow, and then the ghettoization of northern cities, and then the kind of mass incarceration and the different forms that racial inequality takes today. There's a famous 19th century saying, "The law in its majesty forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, stealing bread, and begging in the streets. But of course, the rich don't need to do these things, only the poor do." So this system of criminalization was designed only to affect those who are on the losing end of existing economic relationships. So that even when those laws are procedurally properly enforced, they have the effect of worsening economic inequalities. That burden of policing in the legal system falls on the already most vulnerable and disconnected communities, while the offenses or harms that wealthier players enact are often deemed legal and almost always outside the realm of what we consider police power. They're considered to be regulatory problems or political problems, or are actually celebrated, lionized. So we have a system that treats harms differently, that treats different communities differently, and the politically neutral, professional, and procedurally proper implementation of those systems in and of itself produces inequalities. So let's take a step back. I mentioned this task force on 21st century policing that President Obama created, which issued hundreds of recommendations, and many police departments in the United States embraced many of these reforms. We started this talk with the mention of George Floyd. Professor Lima mentioned that as a very important flashpoint here in the United States. He was killed by police in Minneapolis, but Minneapolis was actually one of the cities that most forcefully embraced the recommendations of President Obama's task force. Just a few years ago, they produced a very fancy, glossy brochure outlining all these amazing procedural reforms that they had adopted. The officers involved directly and indirectly with the killing of George Floyd that day had implicit bias training, de-escalation training, mindfulness training, were wearing body cameras, were operating under a new, more restrictive use of force policy. We're operating under a new policy that required that officers intervene if they witness misconduct by a fellow officer. They were operating under a new early warning system designed to identify officers with a history of misconduct, which some of them had. And none of these reforms made any difference. George Floyd's life just did not matter to them. And this can't be fixed with a few procedural training programs. The problem is baked into the decision to turn a whole set of social problems and political problems over to police to manage. And this is really how we should understand the functional role of policing, at least so much of what police actually do. We often labor under this illusion that police are out chasing bank robbers and finding hidden serial killers and this sort of thing. But of course, anyone who works closely with police knows that this is not what police do, that 95, 98% of policing is the constant management of a host of very low-level disorder problems. They are intervening into the lives of people whose lives are disordered, who may be involved in black market activity, who may be experiencing a mental health crisis, who may be involved in low-level violent confrontations in their communities, who experience public drunkenness, who are involved in domestic disputes. But the root of these problems, of course, is almost always deep economic inequality and social marginalization. And what the state has done is it has said that these problems are beyond our desire or ability to properly control, reduce, eliminate. So we're going to use policing not to solve them, but to put a lid on them. So let's look for a second at a couple of the very popular reforms and think through a little bit about why they can't possibly fix the problem, and then talk a little bit about what we might do instead. So one of the most popular reforms, not just in the United States, but increasingly internationally, is implicit bias training. Police and government leaders have had to acknowledge that in many parts of the world, there is very powerful evidence of stark racial inequalities in the nature of policing, at the very least in the outcomes of policing. Stops, arrests, use of force, deaths are all racially disproportionate. Now, police will claim, well, we just go where the crime is, and if crime is more heavily concentrated in communities of color, then that's not our fault. We just have to manage that problem. And there's some truth to that. The problem is much deeper. The problem is, why have we produced communities of color with long-term entrenched poverty and social dislocation that then invariably produce a certain amount of social disorder and what we can call crime, black market activity, interpersonal violence, etc. Well, this is, of course, the product of long histories of reproducing racial inequality, discrimination in housing, discrimination in employment markets, discrimination in the delivery of government services. And then we've labeled the consequences of those social policies crime and disorder and said they're to be managed by policing. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the so-called broken windows theory, which rests on this very platform. It says the problems of society, disorder, crime, economic dislocation, are not the result of government policy or broad changes in the economy. They're the result of the moral insufficiency of certain individuals who have become disorderly and out of control. And the way to fix that problem is through intensive and invasive policing. So implicit bias training says, oh, well, these racial disparities are not the result of structural factors, and they're not the result of intentional conscious racism. It's all just accidental, unconscious, unintentional. And if we could just make officers slightly more self-consciously aware of their unconscious racial biases, that this will somehow magically change the racially disparate outcomes of American policing or British policing or Dutch policing or wherever. Well, it turns out it doesn't work, because how could it work? You know, first of all, we do have a problem of explicit individual officer racism in the United States. It's not a majority of officers, but we find many instances of officers involved in racist organizations, making racist statements on social media platforms, engaging in racist conversations with their fellow officers while on the job. So we know there is a reservoir of individual level explicit racism that's not going to be fixed with a few lectures on the history of racism in America. But the real problem rests on exactly these larger structural features that I mentioned before. The decision to turn the problems of primarily Black and brown communities into crime and disorder problems to be managed by policing. And this is, again, not a faulting of the police. This is a political failure. The police did not create globalization. The police did not create austerity. The police did not create deindustrialization in the United States. These were political decisions, and then police have been given the task of managing the symptoms. But they have the wrong tools for managing those symptoms. And this is the problem I have with so-called community policing, which of course is very popular, especially after a period of protest that questions the legitimacy of policing. Community policing rests on the fundamental belief that what communities need to do is bring their problems to the police so that police can develop problem-oriented solutions to those issues. But what tools exactly do police have to resolve community problems? Do they have access to stable housing, stable income, high quality mental health care services, medically based drug treatment, jobs for young people? No, they don't have access to any of that. What police have access to are handcuffs and nightsticks, handguns, pepper spray, tear gas, riot shields, right? What distinguishes police from other parts of government is their capacity and authorization to use violence. Police are violence workers. even when they don't use violence, their presence in a situation is always the direct implied threat to use violence. And that's where police authority rests, not in some abstract notion of the rule of law, but in that capacity and willingness to use violence. And community policing just reinstills this idea that the solution to community problems is to unleash violence workers, when what these communities really need are community organizers, nurses, social workers, and some kind of political empowerment that gives them more control over their own futures. But that is rarely on offer, because that would challenge the kind of fundamental political relationships that have been created that rest on the political disempowerment and economic exploitation of those communities. So once again, we see this as a political problem. So what should we do? Well, in the United States, we have defunded public education, creates students that doesn't treat them as holistic people. And this has produced disruption and disorder in schools. And rather than fixing that problem, we flooded our schools with police, with armed police, who arrest and use violence against the most vulnerable populations in our schools, students with disabilities and our poorest students, and most of whom are non-white. We don't need to give those school police more training, more sensitivity, get them to be mentors. No, we need to replace school police with teachers' aides, counselors, social workers. And we need to empower students to take a greater role in producing a safe environment for themselves, to give them a stake in producing a safe and effective learning environment, rather than treating them as the object of both administrative discipline and policing. So what people are calling for in the United States is no more reform, no more money for training, no more money for technology. What we want is alternatives to policing. We want community-based mental health services. But between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis because we have no mental health services. And those problems dump into the lap of police who don't have the right tools to manage problems. We need community-based anti-violence services. We need to address long-standing entrenched poverty in the United States, which is a major producer of interpersonal violence in our society. Every time we empower policing to solve these problems, it's a way of saying these problems are at root problems of moral insufficiency rather than problems of structural inequality. So let me talk a couple words about abolition and what that means to me. We have a large, robust movement in the United States that has first, primarily focused on the abolition of prisons, and now is also focused on the issue of policing. Now, no one that I know who is involved in actually organizing, working with people in communities imagines that somehow magically tomorrow all police could just disappear and then we'll figure out what to do after that. That's not realistic. No government is just going to eliminate their police force because of a couple of protests. And that's not really what people are asking for. Abolition is about a process. It's a long-term process of trying to produce a different kind of society. It's about building up something new and better. And in the process, reducing our reliance on policing and prisons to manage what are essential political problems. So as we build up community-based mental health services, we can take that responsibility away from the police. As we fix schools, we can take that problem away from police. As we develop more family supports and create healthier communities, we can reduce those responsibilities. When we develop better responses to substance abuse problems, we can eliminate narcotics units. Other places are doing parts of this. The country of Portugal has eliminated narcotics policing for the most part. They have decriminalized narcotics and treat it as a public health problem. And the results have been very positive. The public health outcomes have gotten better. The public order problems have gotten better. Both the Portuguese public and the Portuguese police are very happy with their decision. And recently, here in the United States, voters in our state of Oregon voted to decriminalize all drugs there and to shift resources into public health interventions instead. Harm reduction strategies like supervised injection facilities, needle exchange, drug testing capacities, access to high quality medically based drug treatment are all better alternatives than using policing. Secondly, abolition is an analysis. It's an analysis that says that policing and prisons have always been rooted in a project of producing race and class inequality. And once we have that analysis, it makes us extremely skeptical about procedural reforms designed to restore legitimacy to institutions that are at root illegitimate. We don't need kinder, gentler, more professional policing. We need real solutions to our community problems. And finally, abolition is about a long-term vision. People who feel that they would rather live in a world that isn't governed by the use of violence workers and the putting of human beings into cages. I think that's a vision most of us share, or at least aspire to. But we don't claim to know exactly what that ideal new world would look like. We understand it's a process, but better that we begin to build those alternatives than invest our time, energy, and resources in building up an institution that we think is fundamentally flawed. Now, these ideas in many ways have originated in the United States, primarily in communities of color. Most of the more visible proponents of these ideas are actually women of color who have lived in communities with high levels of crime and disorder, and for whom policing has not been the solution to their problem. We often hear, well, you can't possibly reduce the number of police because this will, make women vulnerable to attack. But the reality is the majority of acts against women in the United States are not reported to the police. Most women in the US have lost confidence in the ability or even desire of police to produce real safety for them. We have a long-standing history of police ignoring the claims of women about abuse, sexual assault, rape. We recently discovered that police departments in the United States have tens of thousands of so-called rape kits that are administered after a rape that they've never even analyzed. They go through the motions of taking a report, but the crimes are not really investigated. Police in the United States solve fewer than 10% of all serious crime, in part because the majority of serious crime is never even reported to the police. So we labor under this illusion that police are out here producing this vast cover of public safety. But when we look more carefully, we see that we've grossly overestimated their effectiveness. We've also failed to consider the costs. Police enact a great deal of violence. As much as 10% of all homicides in the United States are committed by police officers. Whether lawful or not, this produces a burden of violence that's heavily concentrated in some communities, that produces trauma that then gets reproduced as more violence. Police officers have been heavily implicated in enacting sexual assaults, abuse of sex workers, harassment of women, and domestic violence in their own households. But also, policing is very financially costly. We have cities in the United States that spend 30, 40, 45% of their local budget to create this massive apparatus of policing with not a lot to show for it. It's also ideologically costly in the way I mentioned before, which is that it reinstills this idea that society's problems are best managed by violence workers. And finally, we fail to consider the viability of alternatives. We have a growing body of research rooted in concrete examples of alternative strategies of producing safe and stable communities. We know that public health interventions work better than policing in managing narcotics problems. We know that mental health teams work better than police, in managing people's mental health problems. We know that counselors and real peer mentors are better than police in keeping schools safe. So we need to disassociate this idea. We need to deconstruct, this idea that the only way to produce public safety is through policing. We need to embrace a culture of experimentation and evaluation, to invest in these alternative strategies to reduce the burden of policing on our already most vulnerable communities. So I want to thank you again for this lovely invitation, and I look forward to taking some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Alex, for your wonderful presentation. You enlightened us about the title, The End of Policing, the Producing Public Safety Without Police. It is a very vast subject, and also the discussion is the deed of the hour. And just I want to ask, some of the questions are mentioned in the chat box. You can read out and answer accordingly. Question in the chat box, and then we'll debate of this topic. Professor Alex.
Okay, so do I think the end of policing will reduce human rights violations like custodial deaths, torture, etc.? Well, I think by definition it would, right? If we quit using police to manage these problems and we instead treat them as problems, then this would reduce this idea that we need to use violence to manage our problems. So fortunately, more recently, American police are not so implicated in things like torture, though we have a long history of that here. But that kind of in-custody use of violence often rests on this very problematic dynamic, which is that the politicians have defined a set of problems as being crime problems to be managed by policing with very little alternative. And so this creates a tremendous burden on the police. They've been told this is their responsibility and this is the metric of their success. And so that pressure leads them in the direction of abuses, in part because normal policing is not really that effective. And so police grow frustrated. They say, oh, defendants have too many rights, or the folks who commit crime, are getting away with murder. The community is terrified, and the community also has been told the solution to your problem is police. So when police feel all this pressure, and when normal so-called lawful or procedurally proper policing doesn't work, which it often doesn't, there will be this pressure to engage in extra legal policing. Improper searches, improper questioning, use of violence in custody, extrajudicial violence on the street. We see, for instance, in Brazil, police death squads. They can't solve the problems of entrenched poverty that are producing like street robberies from children who are homeless, et cetera. So the police are now implicated in going out and just killing kids on the street who they view as criminal youth. So instead of saying police are the solution to all those problems and then looking the other way when they use violence and human rights abuses, we should say, look, why do we have this massive population of homeless streets? Let's start really trying to take some political responsibility for doing something about that and empower outreach workers, create some stable housing and employment schemes for those youth. I mean, these are big challenges, but when we turn those problems over to policing, there's going to be human rights abuses. That's my view. The next question I see is about Naxalism, the left-wing movements, I understand, in Assam and some of the eastern provinces. You know, I'm not an expert on those separatist movements, but communist, Leninist leaning movements, whatever they are. But again, the general message here is that is a political problem. And the Indian state has been unable and unwilling to try to come up with a political solution. And when that happens, they then turn the problem over to security forces, military and police to manage. So my view is when we see a problem turned over to security forces, we should look for the political failure that undergirds it. But I can't get into the details. I'm just not knowledgeable enough about that. If you look seriously at community linkage with industrialization, state put pressure on them, snatch their land by police, or right? Okay, so this is a great question, right? Professor Lima mentioned before that we see the origins of policing throughout the world in the primary systems of economic exploitation of the late 18th and early 19th century, which are slavery, colonialism, and mass industrialization. But we don't have, you know, slavery and colonialism in that sense anymore. The new kind of exploitation is the rise of these global international corporations and the system of free trade, deregulation, neoliberalism, austerity that goes along with that. So what we've seen is the state, rather than trying to make sure we have broad security and economic prosperity, economic security and prosperity, is picking winners, is making deals, right? Is saying, oh, if I support certain economic actors on the local, state, national, and global stage, they will become successful. Some of that success will kick back to me personally and politically. And I don't really think about the overall consequences for the broader society. Or I buy into an ideology that says, well, development is just automatically good for everyone. But in fact, development not involves displacement, the problems like gentrification, etc. So there is resistance to the taking of land, to the displacing of populations. And then those problems are turned over to police. So police are used to forcibly clear places, etc. So again, these are political problems. We need to question this strategy of economic development, which benefits some people, but also creates a whole population of economic losers, so to speak, people on the losing end of these arrangements who are then criminalized and subjected to policing. I hope that answered the question. So police have the capability to use violence in order to solve a problem in a community. So there are many problems. So as many problems, let me put my glasses on. Problems arise when an innocent person is tortured by the police, whether or not solve these problems. Okay. So, you know, one of the dominant strategies for doing something about the obvious abuses of policing has been to embrace a human rights framework that says, oh, well, people have certain basic human rights to be, they have the right to life, they have the right to be free of cruel and unusual punishment, such as torture. They have the right to some kind of due process under the law. And that if we could just get the state and the police to respect those rights broadly, that would reduce the abusiveness of policing. So it's very easy to see the appeal of this framework. But what this framework ignores, in my view, are all the very profound political pressures placed on police to operate outside of a human rights framework. Too often, the police cannot do what they have been actually tasked with to do within a human rights framework, whether it's the suppression of leftist movements or the suppression of crime. And they revert back to what they know, which is the use of violence, coercion, threats, etc., to manage problems. So human rights training has been a notorious failure. Show me the country where NGOs came in, did human rights training, and then the policing showed dramatic changes. I'm not aware of any such cases, and I've looked at this training in Africa and Latin America. It's a system for relegitimating policing that has very little impact on the way that policing is really done. In the US, what I say is, rather than thinking we can train our way out of this, we need to get rid of the war on drugs, get rid of the war on terror, get rid of our war on gangs and our war on crime. Because when we tell the police they're at war with the public, there's going to be violence. It's going to be extra legal and a violation of people's basic human rights. And if we don't want those things, then we should find ways to solve our problems other than policing. I think that's all the questions that I see I got to scroll down some here. How do you explain, oh, I lost it, where'd it go? Oh, how do you explain the political presence of police? Okay, so police themselves have become a somewhat independent political force. They have formed associations. In some cases, they have linked themselves to political parties. This is true internationally and in the US. And institutionally, right, policing is rooted in a worldview that says that the world is filled with predators, the world is divided up into good people and bad people, and we need to use violence, coercion, and force to X out and control the bad people. Well, that's a political philosophy. That's not neutral. And when that political philosophy is validated and operationalized in the political realm, it's very conservative. And it cuts off the possibility of more progressive structural changes. So we need to directly, in my view, directly counter this idea that when police say they need more money to solve crime, that this is somehow politically neutral is just not true. And we need to push back against that. Do you think policing in India somehow criminalized the voice of dissent in the name of unlawful activities, Prevention Act, the problem of Jammu Kashmir and northeastern state address? Okay, so, but the entire history of Indian policing going back to colonialism is a history of political suppression. I mean, that's why the Indian police were created by the British, was as a tool for the more nuanced management of resistance across India to colonial rule. Much more efficient and effective than trying to mobilize the British military. It's cheaper. You can hire local people as rank and file officers, that you embed them in communities. You create an ideology of public safety to justify their preemptive interventions and intelligence gathering. I mean, the Indian police, the thing that they are most efficient at, from my understanding, is the gathering of local intelligence and the reporting of that back to the center. And none of that changed with independence. You know, the Congress movement had a decision to make at independence about what to do about the Indian police service. And what they did is they changed a few people at the top of the hierarchy and left the entire system intact. They wanted to use the Indian police in the same way that the British did, as a system for intelligence gathering, the suppression of dissent, and the management of a whole series of social problems. So that is the history of Indian policing, at least as far as I've been able to read into it. I'm sure people will have other ideas about that, and I'm interested to hear them if we have some time. So let me just, on human rights violations, extreme freedom is dangerous. Not obeying the law and order is a habit of some people. Okay, so sure, we can talk about the fact that there are people who will try to take advantage of other people, and people who commit harms against other people. Well, that's clearly the case. The issue here is not to remove policing and then see what happens. The point is to begin to directly address why those things exist. Now, some of them are deeply culturally embedded, and they can't be changed overnight. This may take, generations even in some cases to change these cultural patterns that have evolved. But turns out, at least in the examples that I've looked at, which are not in India, when you give people stable housing and stable employment and access to decent quality services, then offending goes down, especially violence goes way, way down. So, and policing just has not been very effective. It's not like have a massive apparatus of policing in India and also tons of property crime and organized crime. So it's not actually proving to be all that effective. Murder, theft, riot disturbance, all these activities are also violations of human rights. Yes, I agree that we don't want harms, whether they're committed by police or members of the community or economic elites. The whole point of this movement is harm reduction. And the claim has been that the current system of turning the whole thing over to police is not preventing these harms very effectively, especially vulnerable populations. So, better strategies for managing these problems than just imagining how policing is the best and only possible way to do this. All right, let me see if the last live questions or pushback on something.
Dr. Dan, Jana? If, Dr. Jana wants to last comment on this topic. Dr. Jana. Dr. Jana.
Please invite Charudotto Panigrahi, sir.
So he's not available here, so that if you'll give the last comment on this topic, and then Charudotto Panigrahi is not here. He's not available. And any question by you or others, then
Every question answered very well by Professor Alex. So I think don't waste time. I go for formal vote of thanks.
I should go for.
Well, those were amazing.
Jana?
Those were amazing questions. So I really enjoyed it.
It's really, sir, thought-provoking session. I last few years not listening such a wonderful initiation, and you are doing such a fabulous research about policing. And this end of policing is a very, very, very interesting piece of work done by you. And the whole thing is about India and USA is different. But in India, I think end of policing is very terrible kind of things in terms of Mao's left-wing extremists and about Naxals, about the whole problem of terrorism is concerned. But I think probably your answers might be well and thought-provoking, and thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
Well, yes, Charudotto Panigrahi is here among us. If he'll give the last comment on this topic, and then he'll go for the formal vote of thanks. There's already the question and answer session have already been finished. If Charudotto will give the last comment on this topic.
Yeah, thanks, Professor Lima. In fact, thank you so much, Professor Alex. I mean, that in many ways opened our eyes. I'll tell you why. Because one concern that we had was, is defunding the only answer? Or can we do that? Is it possible to do that? Is it prudent to do that? And the second point was, how much of moral obligation do we as citizens carry when we talk about policing or abolition of policing? So these are the two aspects which directly affect all of us in our day-to-day life. And more importantly, when you touched upon the international, I mean, you spoke about US situation, but I tell you, I mean, the situation is more or less the same everywhere. It's more or less the same everywhere. Probably things came to the fore because of a few issues like Floyd and others, but there is this thing always latent. A slight provocation here and there, and we see the true colors, you know, the thing coming to the fore. So I mean, having said that, there is a strong civil society organization also here in India. I'm talking about the Indian context. But to tell you very honestly, frankly, we haven't been able to gather momentum about policing the way we should have done. And having a human rights commission here and there is not the only answer. We just can't go on creating departments to know where you want to, how you want to put your officers in. And here in India, the police force is, I would say, more or less quite amenable to changes in training and development. But one has to have that kind of a leadership, one has to have that kind of a drive to do that. We have about, about less than 1 million police officers, and US has about, you have about less than 1 million, and India has about 3-4 times of that, about 2 million, 2.5, slightly less than 2.5 million. So you can imagine the, and if you want to bring this change, you can imagine the integrities of every department, the intersectoral linkages. There's so many intricate things that we have to take care of before we can think of this kind of a reforms. However, reforms are underway, and thank you so much, Professor Alex, for sharing your thoughts and this very useful presentation. we look forward to more interactions with you, certainly, because this is in 45 minutes or 1 hour is not enough for this kind of a topic. We realize that, and we don't do justice. So to stop policing, we need to do justice to our own discussion. So we'd be happy to have you sometime later again.
Well, it
Thank
would
you.
be my great pleasure, and I only hope that sometime we will have a chance to meet together in person.
Sure. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Professor.
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
And I would request Professor
Panigrahi.
Limma to share Professor Alex's email ID and all the coordinates. So anybody who's interested to share some thoughts can do that.
Sure. So thank you, Mr. Charajata Panigrahi. Again, I want to thank Professor Alex Vitale, for being with us and accepted our invitation to spend about 60 minutes with us. And thank you so much, Professor Alex, for being with us. And you accepted our invitation from your busy schedule, and you joined from the New York, United States. This topic was the end of policing public safety without police. You enlightened about this topic, and we were really thankful, Dr. Alex, and grateful to you. And we look forward to see you in this in near future. In this, if you'll organize in the next conference in physical level. And thank you so much, Professor Alex. I'd like to thank all the participants, those who have joined in this meeting, and those who are connected in the YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook, and all the students, the researchers, teachers, professors, academics, and all these. I'd also like to thank the coordinators, Subham Das, Kamal Prasad Mahanti, Ghanshyam Giri, Rudranayan Das, Chinmay Kumar Sahu, and all the, particularly the patrons of this conference, the director of IIM Sambalpur, the vice chancellor of Central University of Koraput, Central University of Odisha Koraput, and the convener. Particularly, I'm really thankful and grateful to Mr. Charajata Panigrahi, sir. You spend your valuable time with us, and you also requested our invitation to be with you. And also, I finally thanks to Mr. Dr. Vikram Kesari Jana, the director of the Center for Adivasi Research and Development. He is the key person behind all this in this program. And I'm really thankful to Dr. Jana. And also, thanks to all for being with us. Thank you. Have a good day to Alex. And thank you all.